Vienna, 1865. You're standing in a corridor that smells like cold stone, and something worse underneath it, something chemical and sweet that you don't want to identify. Two guards are dragging a man past you. He's fighting them. He's screaming that there's been a mistake, that he's a doctor, that someone needs to listen, that he doesn't belong here. The guards don't answer him. They throw him into a cell at the end of the corridor, and when he tries to push back out, they hit him until he stops. You hear the door lock. You hear him quieter now, still talking to no one. And then you don't hear him anymore. Days later, he's dead. Infected wounds, a body covered in bruises. The official cause of death uses words like brain exhaustion and general decline, the kind of language institutions reach for when they'd rather not describe what actually happened in a room. The man who died in that cell had spent his entire adult life trying to prove one thing: that deadly infections could be prevented with something as basic as washing your hands. His name was Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. And if you've never heard of him, that's not an accident. It's because medical history found it easier to file him away as an eccentric footnote, a sad case study in a psychology textbook, than to admit what he actually represented. Living proof that powerful institutions, when confronted with evidence that incriminates them, would rather destroy the messenger than change their behavior. In 1846, Semmelweis took a position at the first obstetrical clinic at Vienna General Hospital. At the time, one of the largest and most prestigious medical complexes in Europe, a place where the empire trained the next generation of its doctors. What he walked into was a quiet massacre, dressed up as medical inevitability. Women were giving birth, and days later dying from something called puerperal fever, an infection that spread through the body until it killed, often within a week of delivery. In some months, the death rate at that clinic climbed close to 30%. 30 out of every 100 women who walked in to give birth left in a coffin. Mothers said goodbye to newborns they'd never get to raise. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. In a second clinic in that same hospital, just down the hall, where midwives, not doctors, handled deliveries, the death rate was dramatically lower, sometimes by a factor of 5 or more. Semmelweis became obsessed with that gap. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to stumble onto a truth that 19th century medicine simply had no framework for accepting. And when he eventually said it out loud, the cost would be his own sanity, and ultimately his life. If you're here, it's probably because you also sense that there are truths history has quietly swept under the rug. Not because they were false, but because they were too dangerous for the people in power to admit. That's exactly why the Unseen Key exists. We pull back that rug. Every video on this channel is an act of rescuing memory from people and institutions that wanted it gone. If you believe, like we do, that these stories deserve to be remembered, and that the people who paid the price for them deserve to be vindicated by the truth, hit like right now and subscribe. It's not a generic ask. It's a vote that forgetting doesn't get to win. And Semmelweis's story is just getting started. Before any of it, before the wards, before the numbers, Semmelweis was supposed to be a lawyer. That was the plan his father had for him. Josef Semmelweis was a grocer in Buda, part of a moderately prosperous merchant family in a city that was, at the time, still administratively separate from Pest, the two halves of what would later become Budapest. Ignaz was one of 10 children, raised in a household that valued stability, and a respectable legal career was exactly the kind of stability a successful grocer wanted for his son. So Ignaz went off to the University of Vienna to study law, like he was told, and then, not long after arriving, he switched to medicine instead, with little explanation that survives beyond the simple fact that something about it pulled at him harder than the courtroom ever could. He completed his medical degree at the University of Vienna in 1844, And after a brief stint trying to secure a position in internal medicine, which didn't pan out, he ended up almost by default in obstetrics, a specialty that at the time carried far less prestige than surgery or internal medicine. Obstetrics was considered, by the standards of Viennese medical hierarchy, a lesser field, which is its own quiet irony, given what was about to happen there. By the time he landed his post at Vienna General in the 1840s, the man walking those halls wasn't the grim, exhausted figure most people picture when they hear his name. People who knew him in those years describe someone sociable, even a little restless, the kind of person who enjoyed company, enjoyed cards, enjoyed an evening that had nothing to do with hospital wards. He had energy, he had warmth. None of that fits the popular image of Semmelweis, and that's exactly the point. In 1857, in Pest, he married Maria Weidenhofer. She was significantly younger than him, in her early 20s to his late 30s, the daughter of a merchant family. By most accounts from people around them, the early years of that marriage looked like an ordinary, even happy domestic life. Letters and second-hand recollections from friends in Pest describe a household with children arriving one after another, 5 in total, though not all of them survived childhood, which was tragically common for the era. A man who came home from a ward where he was achieving results nobody else in Europe could match, and who for a while got to just be a husband and a father in the evenings. Hold on to that image, because it matters for what comes later. The man who would eventually be dragged into an asylum, screaming, fighting, unrecognizable to the people who loved him, started out as someone capable of an entirely normal, even pleasant life. Whatever happened to him over the following decade didn't happen to a man who was always unstable, always difficult, always that way. It happened to someone who, by every account, used to be fine. And there's one more thing worth knowing about those early Vienna years, something that explains why Semmelweis approached the puerperal fever mystery the way he did, when nobody else had. He didn't just observe. He counted, obsessively. Month by month, he tracked admissions, deaths, causes, cross-referencing clinic against clinic, year against year, building tables of numbers at a time when most doctors were still working from impressions, anecdotes, and inherited assumptions. That habit, that almost compulsive need to turn observation into hard numbers, is what let him see a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight in the hospital's own records for years, waiting for someone willing to actually add it all up. Nobody had bothered. He did. And once he did, the man with cards in his hand and children at home was about to find out exactly what it costs to be the first person to say something nobody wants to hear. To understand what Semmelweis was up against, you need to understand the place he worked in more detail than most retellings bother with. The Vienna General Hospital, the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, wasn't just a hospital in the modern sense. It was a sprawling institutional city within the city, with thousands of beds, dozens of departments, and a teaching apparatus that trained doctors from across the entire Austrian Empire and beyond. Inside it, the first obstetrical clinic functioned as a training ground for medical students, future doctors who spent their mornings performing autopsies on corpses in the hospital morgue, often multiple per day, and then, hours later, with nothing more than a quick rinse of their hands, sometimes not even that, walked straight into the maternity ward to examine women in labor, often dozens of women per shift, using the same hands, sometimes the same fingers, that had just been inside a cadaver. The second clinic, just down the corridor, was reserved for training midwives. Midwives didn't perform autopsies. They had no contact with cadavers. Their training was hands-on, focused entirely on delivery technique, with none of the pathology work that defined the medical student's curriculum. And month after month, year after year, the numbers were brutal. The first clinic killed far more women than the second, sometimes by a margin that, on paper, looked less like a statistical anomaly and more like an indictment. Semmelweis, in his late 20s when he started, found himself staring at a puzzle that nobody around him seemed interested in solving, partly because solving it wasn't really anyone's job. The hospital's senior staff had grown accustomed to the death rate. It was simply what childbirth in a teaching hospital looked like. A grim cost of doing business that nobody questioned, because questioning it would have implied something was wrong with how the institution operated. The explanations of the time sound absurd by modern standards, but they were the genuine scientific consensus of the day, taught in lecture halls and published in respected journals. Puerperal fever was blamed on miasmas, invisible poisonous vapors thought to rise from sewage, decaying matter, or even from the bodies of the sick themselves, drifting through wards and infecting anyone nearby. It was blamed on atmospheric imbalances, shifts in barometric pressure, even the phase of the moon in some older texts. And it was blamed with a kind of casual cruelty that's hard to read today on the emotional state of the patients themselves, the supposed shame or fright women felt being examined by male medical students, as though embarrassment could curdle into a fatal infection. Semmelweis tested theory after theory, methodically, the way his counting habit had trained him to. He looked at the position women gave birth in, on their sides versus on their backs. He checked ventilation in the wards, had windows opened, closed, rearranged. He even investigated whether the order in which patients were admitted mattered, whether something about overcrowding on certain days correlated with outbreaks. At one point, he focused on a Catholic priest who walked through the ward each day, ringing a small bell as he passed through on his way to administer last rites to dying patients in a back room. Semmelweis theorized that the sound of that bell, a daily reminder of death, ringing past the beds of women who were themselves frightened and vulnerable, might be psychologically triggering some kind of fatal decline. He arranged for the priest to take a longer route, avoiding the ward entirely, and to ring no bell. The death rate didn't move. Then, in March of 1847, something happened that would change everything. A colleague of Semmelweis, a pathologist named Jakob Kolečka, who taught forensic medicine and worked closely with the same students rotating through the morgue, accidentally cut himself during an autopsy. The cut came from a scalpel that a student had just used to dissect a corpse. It was a minor wound, the kind doctors and students sustained constantly and rarely thought twice about. Days later, Kolečka developed a fever, then spreading inflammation, then the unmistakable progression of a systemic infection. He died, and when Semmelweis attended the autopsy on his own colleague's body, what he saw inside matched almost organ for organ the autopsy findings he'd seen over and over again in the bodies of women who died of puerperal fever. That's the moment the pieces started clicking into place inside Semmelweis's head. A man with no connection to childbirth, no uterus, no postpartum complications, had died of something that looked, under the microscope and on the autopsy table, identical to the disease-killing mothers down the hall. And what Semmelweis was about to conclude from that single observation was so simple and so damning that even he would need time to fully process the weight of what he'd just discovered. Semmelweis arrived at a conclusion that, looking back, seems almost obvious. But in Vienna in 1847, it was close to scientific heresy. If Kolečka had died because he'd introduced something from a corpse directly into his own bloodstream through a small wound, and if his symptoms and autopsy findings were essentially identical to puerperal fever, then the women in the first clinic weren't dying from miasmas, or shame, or bad air. or moonlight. They were dying because the doctors and students themselves, coming straight from the morgue, were carrying what Semmelweis called cadaverous particles, some unseen material from decomposing bodies on their hands and instruments, and introducing it into the bodies of laboring women during routine internal exams. Germ theory, as we understand it today, didn't exist yet, not in any form doctors took seriously. Louis Pasteur wouldn't publish his foundational work on microorganisms causing disease for more than a decade, and Joseph Lister wouldn't apply antiseptic principles to surgery until the 1860s. Semmelweis didn't have the word bacteria. He didn't have a microscope powerful enough or a theoretical framework to see what was actually happening. He talked about decaying cadaverous matter being mechanically transferred from a doctor's hands into a patient's body, a description that sounds almost crude next to modern microbiology. But the mechanism he described, contact transmission of an infectious agent from a contaminated source to a vulnerable patient, was, in essence, exactly right. He'd reverse-engineered the correct answer using nothing but observation, autopsy comparisons, and his own obsessive records. The solution he proposed was devastatingly simple and devastatingly cheap. Starting in May of 1847, he required every doctor and student leaving the morgue to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, essentially a strong chlorine solution, before examining any patient in the maternity ward. Not ordinary soap and water, which most doctors considered sufficient and which did little against whatever was actually being transferred. Chlorinated lime specifically, because Semmelweis had noticed that its strong, almost caustic smell could fully eliminate the lingering odor of decay that clung to hands and forearms after autopsies. An odor so persistent that doctors sometimes carried it with them for hours. If the smell, the most obvious sign of cadaverous matter, could be chemically destroyed, Semmelweis reasoned, then whatever was causing the infections was probably being destroyed along with it. The results were immediate and statistically impossible to ignore. Before the policy, the death rate in the first clinic in April of 1847 had been close to 18% for the month, a fairly typical figure for that ward. By June, just weeks after the hand-washing protocol went into effect, it dropped to around 2%. In some following months, it came close to zero, dropping below the second clinic's numbers entirely. The clinic that had always been the safe one, the one staffed by midwives with no morgue exposure at all. Sit with that for a second. Within a few months, using nothing but a basin, a chemical that cost almost nothing, and a mandatory routine that took less than a minute per patient, Semmelweis had taken a ward with a near 1 in 5 death rate and brought it down to nearly zero. He was holding data that, if applied across every teaching hospital in Europe, would save hundreds of thousands of women's lives over the following decades. He had robust, replicable, statistically undeniable proof, the kind of before and after comparison that, in any other context, would have been treated as a medical triumph worthy of immediate, empire-wide adoption. And it was exactly that, the undeniability of the numbers, that turned his discovery from a scientific triumph into a social death sentence. Because for those numbers to make sense, there was only one possible conclusion. And it was a conclusion that no respected doctor in Europe, least of all the senior physicians running the first clinic, was prepared to accept about himself. Picture the hallway outside the maternity ward at Vienna General. A senior physician walks through it every morning, hands still carrying the faint smell of the dissection room from an hour earlier. A smell so routine he probably doesn't even register it anymore. He's respected. Decades of training and years of teaching got him here, to a position where students defer to him and patients trust him without question. And now a junior assistant, a man not long out of obstetrics, a specialty most of his peers consider secondary, is telling him, in effect, that those hands, the ones that built his entire reputation, that performed thousands of exams and deliveries, have been killing the patients he swore to protect. That's the sentence Semmelweis was actually delivering underneath the statistics. Not wash your hands. But you've been the cause of this all along and you didn't know it. And neither did anyone who trained you. In 19th century Vienna, medicine was busy becoming an elite profession, something closer to priesthood than trade, especially within the prestigious institutions of the Austrian Empire. A doctor's authority came from his education, his bearing, his social class, his command of Latin and theory, not from scrubbing his hands like a servant before touching a patient. Hand-washing, in the cultural context of the time, was associated with domestic labor, with the working class, with the kind of physical, menial task that educated men had spent their entire lives being trained away from. So when Semmelweis pushed his hand-washing protocol, framing it as a mandatory, non-negotiable procedure for every physician regardless of rank, a lot of his colleagues didn't hear scientific finding. They heard you're no better than the help, and you've been killing people because of it. He also handed his enemies a gift without meaning to, partly because of timing. 1848 was a year of revolutions across Europe, including in Vienna and across the Hungarian lands Semmelweis came from. The political upheaval that swept through the Austrian Empire that year touched the medical establishment too, with shifting allegiances, suspicion of outsiders, and a general institutional nervousness about anything that challenged existing hierarchies. Semmelweis, a Hungarian working in an increasingly tense Viennese institution, was already an outsider in subtle ways. And his theory arrived at a moment when authority figures across Vienna were particularly unwilling to entertain anything that smelled like a challenge to their standing. Instead of writing up his findings as a tight, formal paper early on, something that might have given the theory a fighting chance on its scientific merits alone, Semmelweis let the idea spread through lectures, letters, and second-hand accounts among colleagues. Version after version drifting further from what he'd actually found, picking up distortions and oversimplifications along the way. By the time people across the German-speaking medical world were arguing about Semmelweis's theory, a significant number of them weren't even arguing about the real one. His own boss, Professor Johann Klein, became the wall Semmelweis couldn't get past. Klein ran the first clinic. Klein's name, his career, his standing within the hospital's hierarchy were all attached to that clinic's reputation, and Klein had no intention of letting a junior assistant's theory imply that his clinic, under his supervision, had been killing women for years through preventable means. In 1849, when Semmelweis's contract as assistant came up for renewal, a routine administrative process that for someone with his results should have been a formality, Klein simply let it lapse. No confrontation needed, no public dispute, just a door quietly closing, and a position handed instead to someone whose theories made nobody uncomfortable. The attacks that followed weren't only Viennese. German obstetricians like Gustav Adolf Michaelis, a respected figure in Kiel, took the theory apart in print, calling it crude, calling it offensive, questioning both the data and the implications. And in one of the darker footnotes to this story, Michaelis, a man who had personally lost a close family member to puerperal fever, possibly through his own contaminated hands during the delivery, later took his own life. Some historical accounts tie that decision, at least in part, to the weight of having publicly dismissed the one theory that might have explained and possibly prevented that loss. Pushed out of Vienna, isolated, His most important professional relationships severed. Semmelweis did something that looked, from the outside, like giving up. He went home, back to Hungary. What nobody watching could have guessed is that going home was about to hand him the cleanest experiment of his entire career. Pest 1851. A new hospital, a new ward, and for the first time in his career, nobody standing over Semmelweis's shoulder telling him no. As head of obstetrics at St. Rochus Hospital, a position considerably less prestigious than Vienna General, but one that came with something Vienna never gave him: full operational control. He had the freedom to implement his protocol exactly as he believed it should work, without compromise. Without a Professor Klein looking over his shoulder, he ran the same protocol. Chlorinated lime every time, no exceptions, applied to every student and physician before every examination, and the numbers that came back were almost absurd. Death rates from puerperal fever at St. Rochus dropped to around 1%. In some periods even lower, a figure that, by 1850 standards, looked less like medicine and more like magic, especially compared to the death rates still being reported at major hospitals across the German-speaking world that hadn't adopted anything similar. Now he had two cities, two hospitals on opposite ends of the empire, run under completely different administrations years apart. Two completely independent sets of records, both screaming the exact same answer: wash the hands. And the deaths stop. It's worth stopping here for a moment before the story gets darker, because inside the wreckage of everything Semmelweis was living through, there are numbers that represent something the narrative tends to forget. In the months after he implemented his protocol at St. Rochus in Pest, the ward didn't just produce lower statistics. It produced women who went home, mothers who held their children past the first week, families that didn't receive the knock on the door they were dreading. We don't have their names. Medical records of the era didn't work that way, especially for obstetric patients who were often poor, often unmarried, often women that the institution processed and discharged without ceremony. But the numbers tell us they existed. In some months, the difference between Semmelweis's ward and a comparable ward in Vienna that hadn't adopted his protocol was the difference between 1 death and 18. 17 women in a single month in a single city who lived instead of died because one man insisted on a basin of chlorinated water at the door. Hold that, because what comes next is the story of what the world did to the man who built that basin. It's worth noting that Semmelweis wasn't entirely without support during these years. In Vienna, a dermatologist named Ferdinand von Hebra, one of the more progressive minds in the Viennese medical establishment, had read Semmelweis's early findings and was genuinely impressed. Around 1850, Hebra published articles in a Viennese medical journal explicitly defending Semmelweis's theory and urging its wider adoption, presenting the statistical evidence in a clearer, more accessible form than Semmelweis himself had managed. For a brief window, it looked like the theory might gain real traction through Hebra's advocacy. But Hebra's voice, however respected, wasn't enough to overcome the institutional resistance Semmelweis had already generated, and the broader medical establishment largely continued on as before. In 1861, Semmelweis put everything into one place, a 500-page book laying out years of data from both Vienna and Pest. Clinic by clinic, month by month, an attempt to make the case so thoroughly, so exhaustively, that nobody could wave it away. It was, in terms of sheer evidentiary weight, one of the most comprehensive statistical arguments ever assembled in medicine up to that point. It didn't work. Worse, it backfired. The writing was dense, repetitive, and in places openly furious. Semmelweis had spent over a decade watching colleagues ignore data that, to him, was a matter of life and death, on an almost incomprehensible scale. And that frustration bled into the text. In open letters published around this time, he started directly calling the doctors who continued to reject his findings murderers, accusing them, by name in some cases, of being responsible for ongoing, preventable deaths. And once that word was in print, his opponents didn't need to engage with his data anymore. They could simply point at the man calling respected, tenured physicians killers and say, "Look at him." Does that sound like a scientist to you, or does that sound like someone who's lost his grip? And here's what got lost in that fight, what the noise around his tone obscured. Accepting Semmelweis's theory wasn't just accepting an idea. It meant every senior obstetrician in Europe who had ever lost a patient to childbed fever, which was, realistically, every single one of them, had to sit with the possibility that it had been their hands. Not malice, not negligence in any legal sense, just hands that had never been properly washed, doing exactly what unwashed hands do when they move from a corpse to a living body. Faced with that, most of them chose not to sit with it at all, and while that argument played out in journals and lecture halls across Vienna, Berlin and beyond, back home in Pest, people who'd known Semmelweis for years were starting to notice something. Not in his data, in him. Through the early 1860s, the changes in Semmelweis were gradual enough that the people around him could almost explain them away, one incident at a time. A sharper tone in a meeting than usual, a letter that went further than it needed to, a reaction to criticism that was more personal, more raw than the situation called for. People who'd known him for years told themselves he was tired, that the years of professional rejection had worn him down, that anyone would be irritable after a decade of being ignored while people died needlessly. They weren't entirely wrong, but by 1863 and 1864, the incidents were harder to explain away. Colleagues at the university in Pest, where Semmelweis had been teaching since the mid-1850s, began describing episodes that went well beyond irritability. Outbursts of rage during faculty meetings with no apparent trigger. Moments in the middle of lectures where he seemed to lose the thread entirely, staring at something nobody else could see before snapping back. Behavior in public that colleagues described, in the careful language of the era, as inappropriate or unbecoming of a man of his position, language that almost certainly refers to a combination of erratic speech, social disinhibition, and possibly sexual impropriety. Though the surviving records are elliptical on the specifics, his wife Maria, now in her 30s, with 5 children and a husband she was watching come apart, reportedly tried to shield the household from the worst of it. Friends who visited the family home in Pest during those years left descriptions of a man who could seem almost normal one evening and then, without obvious cause, become someone else entirely. He forgot things. He repeated himself. He fixated. In correspondence from this period, the letters grow increasingly scattered, cycling back to the same arguments against the same critics, written with an intensity that had moved past persuasion into something closer to compulsion. In 1861, Semmelweis sat down and wrote an open letter, not a paper, not a formal submission to a journal, a letter addressed directly to the professors of obstetrics across Europe, men he had spent years trying to reach through data and statistics and 500-page books that nobody read. And in that letter, he finally said what he'd been building toward for 15 years. He wrote, in effect, "If I have no longer the least doubt that the professors of midwifery, who teach students the art of obstetrics without requiring them to wash their hands, are responsible for the deaths that result, then I declare before God and the world that if you continue to ignore this, you are murderers, and the history of childbed fever is your history." Those were not metaphors. He meant every word. He put names to it. He sent it. And the men who received it did not read it as the desperate, factually grounded cry of a scientist watching people die for no reason. They read it as confirmation of what they'd already decided, that the man had finally lost his mind. Modern medical historians, looking back at the full arc of symptoms described across these accounts, memory loss, personality changes, disinhibition, speech difficulties, and physical decline, have raised several hypotheses about what was happening neurologically. One theory discussed seriously in the academic literature is that Semmelweis was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, or another form of early-onset dementia, which would have been entirely unrecognizable as such in 1860s medicine, where the disease itself wouldn't be formally described until 1906. Another hypothesis points toward neurosyphilis, a late-stage syphilitic infection of the central nervous system that produces a well-documented progression of personality changes, cognitive decline, and eventual psychosis. A third possibility, raised by some researchers, is that years of exposure to chlorinated lime and other chemical disinfectants, handled daily without the protective equipment we'd consider basic today, may have contributed to neurological damage over time. The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty, and we probably never will. What the surviving evidence does make clear is that Semmelweis was experiencing a genuine, progressive neurological decline in the last 2 to 3 years of his life. Something that went well beyond exhaustion or emotional distress. Even though exhaustion and emotional distress were also very real parts of his situation. Watch how the machinery works here. The worse Semmelweis got, the easier he became to dismiss. And the easier he became to dismiss, the less anyone had to engage with the data he'd produced years earlier. Back when his mind was sharp and the numbers were clean, his deterioration became, for his critics, a kind of retroactive permission slip, a way of reframing not just the man they saw in 1864, but the man he'd been in 1847, as if the instability they saw at the end had always been there lurking underneath, quietly invalidating everything he'd ever argued. In July of 1865, things reached a point of no return. The precise sequence of events in the days leading up to his commitment is still somewhat unclear in the historical record. But what is established is this: a plan was made, involving colleagues and at least some members of his family, possibly including his wife, to have Semmelweis committed to the Lower Austrian Asylum in Vienna. The plan was implemented by deception. He was told he was traveling, possibly told he was going to be examined or to attend something, and was brought instead to the asylum. Whether his family genuinely believed this was in his best interest, whether they were pressured by colleagues, whether Maria Weidenhofer had simply reached the end of what she could manage alone with 5 children and a husband she barely recognized anymore, history doesn't give us a clear answer. What it does tell us is that on the day Semmelweis arrived at that building, he didn't know he wasn't leaving. What happened inside those walls over the following 2 weeks would become the final chapter of a life devoted to saving mothers and infants. And the way it ended would reveal, with a precision almost too cruel to be coincidental, exactly what the world thought of the man who'd spent 20 years trying to save it. The Niederösterreichische Landesirrenanstalt, the institution where Semmelweis spent his last days, was by 1865 standards considered a relatively modern facility, at least on paper. It had been established in the early 19th century as part of a broader reform movement in European psychiatry, a movement that theoretically advocated for more humane treatment of the mentally ill than the dungeons and chains of earlier centuries. In practice, the gap between the reformers' ideals and the daily reality of life inside these institutions was vast, and for patients like Semmelweis, lethal. Put yourself in that moment. You've been told you're going on a trip, maybe a rest, maybe a consultation. You've been confused lately, you know that. Things have been harder. The arguments feel further away, even as they feel more urgent. And the people around you have been looking at you with an expression you can't quite read. And then the carriage stops at a building you recognize. You know what this building is. You've passed it before, and the people who brought you here are not getting out with you the way you expected. They're handing you to someone else. They're saying things to that someone else in a low voice while you stand there processing what is actually happening. And when it lands, when you understand that the trip was never a trip, you do what any person would do. You fight, you argue, you explain loudly, clearly, with every credential you have, that this is a mistake, that you are a professor of medicine, that you have work, that you are not what they are saying you are. And in 1865, inside a psychiatric institution, that response, the loud insistence that you don't belong there, the refusal to go quietly, the physical resistance to hands that are trying to restrain you, is classified not as the reasonable reaction of a person who has just been deceived. It is classified as further evidence of the condition that justified bringing you here in the first place. The asylum's surviving records, examined in detail by the Hungarian physician and historian Erna Leski in the mid-20th century and subsequently by other researchers, describe a patient who was placed in a straitjacket and confined to an isolation cell within days of arrival. They also describe injuries, documented in the clinical records, with the matter-of-fact brevity typical of institutional medicine of the era, that are consistent with having been beaten, bruising across the torso and limbs, a wound on one hand, described as a laceration or abrasion, that was either not treated or inadequately treated in the days that followed. That wound became the thing that killed him. In the damp, poorly sanitized conditions of an isolation cell in a mid-19th century psychiatric institution, an untreated hand wound progressed. Exactly as Semmelweis had spent 2 decades explaining wounds progressed when they came into contact with infectious material and weren't properly cleaned, into a spreading infection. The redness moved up the arm, the fever came, and within 2 weeks of being admitted, the man who had arguably saved more lives through the simple act of mandating clean hands than almost any other individual in the history of medicine died of sepsis, in a facility that couldn't be bothered to clean the wound on his hand. He died on August 13th, 1865. He was 47 years old. The official death certificate, signed by asylum physicians, listed the cause as weakness, supplemented by references to his mental condition, language carefully chosen to explain a death without actually describing it. No mention of the injuries, no mention of the infection, no mention of the conditions in the isolation cell. Just weakness, the kind of word that closes a file and ends an inquiry before it starts. His body was returned to Vienna for burial. The funeral was quiet, attended by few people, held without ceremony or tribute from the medical establishment he had spent his adult life trying to reform. The graves of greater men got longer eulogies. Semmelweis got a small plot and a headstone, and the silence of an institution that had already moved on. What none of the people who buried him quietly in 1865 could have anticipated was that within just a few years, the entire scientific foundation of what he'd argued would be proven correct, in the most public, most celebrated way possible, and his name would go from an embarrassing footnote to something that the history of medicine couldn't quite figure out how to acknowledge, without also acknowledging everything that had been done to him. There's a particular kind of cruelty in what happened next, a cruelty that doesn't announce itself as cruelty, but that becomes undeniable once you lay the timeline out flat. Semmelweis died in August of 1865. Just 2 years later, in 1867, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister published a series of papers in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, describing a revolutionary approach to preventing surgical infections. Lister had taken Louis Pasteur's germ theory, now gaining real scientific traction across Europe, and applied it directly to the operating room, requiring surgeons to use carbolic acid to disinfect instruments, wounds, and their own hands before operating. The results were dramatic. Post-surgical infection rates, which had been catastrophically high in European hospitals, dropped sharply and consistently. The medical establishment that had destroyed Semmelweis received Lister as a genius. Think about that contrast, and really sit with it, because it's the center of gravity this entire story has been orbiting since the first minute. Lister was working at the right moment. After Pasteur's germ theory had given antisepsis a theoretical framework that allowed people to understand why it worked, not just observe that it did. He was working in Britain, where there was already a slightly more receptive cultural attitude toward the idea of contagion and disease transmission, partly built on decades of debate about quarantine and epidemic control. He was working inside prestigious institutions that supported him, with colleagues who were willing to engage with his methods rather than dismiss them on grounds of professional offense. And when the results came in, the same kind of results Semmelweis had produced 18 years earlier in Vienna and Pest, there was already a scientific language available to explain them in terms the establishment could accept. Lister was knighted. He became Lord Lister. He was celebrated as one of the great benefactors of humanity. And in various speeches and letters over the course of his career, Lister himself acknowledged that Semmelweis had arrived, independently and years before him, at essentially the same practical conclusion, that the hands of doctors were transmitting something deadly to patients, and that chemical cleaning could stop it. Lister was generous in this acknowledgement, more generous than most of his contemporaries. But generosity after the fact, from the man who received all the honors, cannot undo what was done to the man who arrived first and was punished for it. The rehabilitation of Semmelweis's reputation in the decades after his death was slow, uneven, and driven largely by Hungarian national pride rather than by any formal reckoning from the institutions that had destroyed him. In Hungary, he was quickly reframed as a national hero, a brilliant Magyar scientist betrayed by arrogant Viennese authorities, a narrative that was both true and conveniently incomplete, since the Hungarian medical establishment had hardly been uniformly supportive of him either. In 1891, his remains were moved from Vienna back to Budapest in a ceremony that gave him something approaching the recognition he'd never received in life. Today, Semmelweis University in Budapest carries his name. The Semmelweis Museum of Medical History occupies the house on Aprod Street in the old Buda district where he was born. His portrait hangs in medical schools across Europe and North America. Students who have never heard his full story learn his name as a fact, attached to hand-washing and germ theory, without ever learning what that name cost its owner to establish. And this is where the story of Semmelweis stops being just about one man and starts being about something that repeats across disciplines, across centuries, in ways that should make every one of us uncomfortable about how we treat the people who tell us things we don't want to hear. There's a term for what happened to Semmelweis. Psychologists and sociologists call it the Semmelweis reflex, the automatic, often visceral rejection of new evidence or knowledge that contradicts what established authorities already believe, particularly when accepting that evidence would require those authorities to admit they've been wrong, complicit, or harmful. The term was coined in the 20th century, long after his death, as researchers studying institutional resistance to innovation kept finding the same shape of event. In field after field, era after era, it is not a relic. It did not end with the 19th century or with the eventual acceptance of germ theory. Decades after Semmelweis died in that cell, the tobacco industry and segments of the medical establishment spent years publicly contesting the link between smoking and lung cancer, even as the statistical evidence accumulated into something that, by any objective standard, was beyond dispute. The tactics were familiar. Attack the methodology, question the motives of the researchers, fund alternative studies, and when all else fails, redirect attention to the instability or bias of the people doing the warning. The evidence was never really the problem. The implication was, in the 1980s, when Australian physician Barry Marshall proposed that most stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterial infection, Helicobacter pylori, the medical establishment responded with nearly identical reflexes to the ones that had met Semmelweis a century before. The idea was called simplistic, even offensive. Given that stomach ulcers had been treated for decades as a condition related to stress and diet, a framework that had built entire pharmaceutical industries and entire careers. Marshall, unable to get anyone to take his bacterial cultures seriously, famously drank a solution containing the bacteria himself, developed gastritis, treated it with antibiotics, and recovered. A stunt that would have been entirely unnecessary if the evidence alone had been sufficient. He eventually received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2005. The gap between his initial findings and his Nobel Prize was more than 20 years of institutional resistance. The pattern shows up in environmental science in nutrition research, in pharmaceutical safety in workplace medicine. It shows up wherever the evidence, if accepted, would require powerful institutions or individuals to acknowledge that something they've been doing, sometimes for decades, has been causing harm. The specifics change. The shape doesn't. What makes Semmelweis's case uniquely stark is that the harm wasn't abstract. It wasn't spread across populations in ways that allowed for statistical ambiguity or genuine scientific uncertainty. It was happening in a specific ward, in a specific hospital, to specific women who had names and families, and it was measurably, demonstrably preventable, as proven by the numbers from both Vienna and Pest. The gap between what the data showed and what hospitals across Europe actually did wasn't a gap created by scientific uncertainty. It was a gap created by institutional pride, professional self-protection, and the fundamental human unwillingness to accept that you've been the cause of something terrible, even unintentionally, and somewhere in that gap, between what the numbers said and what hospitals actually did, real people were dying. Mothers who had just given birth, women in their 20s and 30s at the most vulnerable moment of their lives, dying of an infection that a basin of chlorinated water and 60 seconds of hand washing could have prevented. Nobody counted those deaths as the cost of pride. Nobody entered them in any ledger under the heading deaths attributable to institutional resistance. But that's what they were, which brings us to the part of this story where everything Semmelweis fought for was finally proven right, in the most public way possible by someone else, somewhere else. Just a few years too late for it to matter to the man who'd paid the highest possible price for being first. Let's go back to that cell in August of 1865. A man dying, his body covered in bruises, an infection eating through his arm. The same kind of infection he'd spent 20 years explaining how to prevent, alone, far from his family. Officially classified as insane by the institution that had just finished beating him. If you knew nothing about who he was, that scene would be one more anonymous tragedy among thousands that played out in European asylums across the 19th century. Unremarkable, unrecorded, forgotten within a generation. But now you know who was in that cell, and knowing that turns the scene into something else entirely. It turns it into evidence. Evidence that being right is not the same as being protected. Evidence that data, even data that is clean and replicable and statistically beyond dispute, can sit in a drawer for 20 years if the people who would have to act on it find acting on it too costly to their pride. Evidence that the institutions we build to pursue knowledge are also built, at the same time, to protect themselves from knowledge that threatens them, and that when those two functions conflict, self-protection wins more often than the textbooks acknowledge. Think about the last time you were in a hospital. Think about the nurse who came into the room and before touching anything, before touching you, paused at the dispenser by the door and cleaned her hands. You probably didn't notice. It's so automatic, so built into the architecture of the space, that it registers as furniture, not as a decision. That dispenser on the wall, that pause, that 30-second routine that happens thousands of times a day in every hospital on Earth, is the world Semmelweis built. He built it from a basin of chlorinated water in a Vienna ward in 1847. From numbers he counted alone by lamplight, while his colleagues ignored him. From a theory he couldn't prove with the science of his time, but proved anyway with the only tool he had, which was data. The World Health Organization runs global campaigns built on exactly what he demonstrated. Medical students learn his name in their first year, and almost none of them learn what that name cost its owner to put into the world. Somewhere right now, in a field you've probably never thought about, someone has the data. They've done the counting, the way Semmelweis did his counting month by month, building a case from numbers that all point the same direction. And somewhere, the people with the power to act on those numbers are finding reasons not to, because acting on them would mean admitting something they're not ready to admit. That's the reason this story doesn't get to disappear. Not because it's sad, though it is. Not because Semmelweis deserves our sympathy, though he does. But because forgetting it means finishing the job his colleagues started in 1865, completing the erasure they began when they let his contract lapse, and continued when they ignored his book, and finished when they signed a death certificate that said weakness instead of writing down what actually happened in that cell. If you felt anything watching this, picture that cell one more time. A man who saved more lives than almost anyone in his century, dying alone, written off as crazy, while the truth he'd already proven sat waiting for someone else to claim the credit. That's the story the unseen key exists to keep alive, not with a promise of what's coming next, but with one simple act, telling it again out loud, to someone who's never heard it, because the only thing that ever beat the Semmelweis reflex wasn't a better argument. It was someone refusing to let the story end where the powerful wanted it to end.